with Coker is a healthcare business podcast from the Coker Group that focuses on solutions to help healthcare organizations effectively navigate the changing healthcare industry landscape.
Welcome back to another episode of Coffee with Coker. My name is Mark Reiboldt, and I host the podcast. And we're going to jump right into the discussion today. One administrative item before I do that. As always, if you like this type of content, we invite you to subscribe and follow us because you can find this episode and all of our episodes at our website, which is coffeewithcoker.com, or you can also find all of our content through cokergroup.com, and also all the social media where you can follow us. And I say that just to remind everyone that you can stay informed on the content that we release weekly and a couple podcasts per month at least, if not more. And so it's this type of content that we typically like to release regularly. And if you want to stay up to speed on that, and then subscribing to us is the best way to do that. And we appreciate everybody's interest in this material. And with that, I want to jump right in. So we have back with us again, Max Reiboldt, who is President and CEO of Coker Group. And of course, he's been on the podcast a number of times. Today, we're talking once again about private equity and the healthcare private equity landscape. That's something we've talked about for a number of times here on the podcast, as well as we've released a number of articles, white papers, and done presentations on various things related to private equity. What we wanted to do here, this is actually going to be a two-part series or two-part episode, this obviously being the first. And we wanted to break down something that we've talked about before, and we've never gone into great depth that I recall, at least on the podcast, on these two key components of private equity deals. We want to compare the non-economic consideration versus the economic consideration when you're considering these types of transactions. Primarily, we're talking about transactions involving private equity and physician groups, medical practices. It can be specialists, it can be surgical specialties, or it can be primary care. Really across the board, as we're seeing many deals continuing to take place in a wide range of specialties in primary care all over the country. In addition to private equity, though, I would also add companies that are maybe backed by private equity. They're for-profit consortiums, platform companies, whatever you want to call them, but many of them have grown quite large already and are continuing to make acquisitions and enter new markets. So I think this is very relevant for a wide range of transaction types, even though we're kind of designating it as private equity. Also, as far as who is this for, any group or an employee within a group may have some interest from the sell side perspective, meaning a potential seller. If you're considering selling your practice and you think private equity or a similar type of company may be a good partner, then I think this information would be helpful. Likewise, on the buy side, if you're a private equity firm or you're a company backed by private equity, and on the for-profit side, I think this stuff would be very interesting to you because, frankly, we've seen a number of transactions take place that the buyers are very in tune with the sellers as far as kind of their needs and wants and expectations and really working with them as partners. However, we've seen a number of cases where a buyer or potential buyer can come into a process and clearly be speaking a different language than covering the expectations of the seller. So I think this could be helpful information for you all as well. But with that long intro, I wanted to jump into our discussion with Max. Today, or in this first part, we're actually going to be covering not the economic consideration, where we'll talk about things like valuation, different ways of looking at the value of a transaction and the different kind of economic benefits for the buyer and seller. But we actually wanted to start with the non-economic consideration. And the reason for that is simply because in many cases, we tend to go straight to, hey, what are the dollar signs? Or the buyer may go straight to, we can, flash a lot of dollar signs out there. And our first recommendation in most cases when we're advising on these transactions is going to be, okay, what else is there? Meaning, what else is going on? So with that, I want to tee up Max, and I'll just ask, when we say that, what do we mean when we say look at the other things, or what else is going on, or what else should be considered as a potential seller looking at a potential transaction?
Thanks, Mark. It's good to be here again on another podcast for Coker. Really interesting question and could go a lot of different ways in terms of the answer. I think from a seller, which is typically the practice, needless to say, or some sort of form of healthcare provider, from their point of view, there's some, and again, since we're really focused today on non-economic features, I think there's a lot of areas that they should be concerned about. So let me just throw a couple out, and then maybe that'll trigger some more discussion, further questions. So first, there's always the question of, right, so we're going to do this deal and we'll get some money up front. We'll get some go forward compensation. You're going to help us grow and expand. Maybe there's something else down the road in terms of a second bite of the apples, we call it, another sale. But really and truly, when the initial deal is completed and we get back together on that, say, Monday morning, what changes operationally? What changes the way we run our business? Maybe even what changes the way we practice? The ideal answer is very little. Not always is that the case. It depends on whether or not the private equity firm has intentions to use the particular practice in question here as a platform, as a flag planning entity for growth and expansion within a region. And it also depends on their level of sophistication relative to their own management. It also depends on the information technology and what the group has versus what has already been formed. So one of the things that we encourage our clients that are practices, we work on both sides, as it were, not at the same time, of course, but when practices are our client or the seller, we typically would say, well, really take a good, strong look at the post-transaction landscape. The management, will it change? Will the staff change? Will the leadership and governance structure change? Is the practice going to be that platform entity upon which other acquisitions will be based and will actually be applied? And if so, what role does that give us? What financial, getting a little bit into economics, what financial ramifications would exist in terms of an MSO and a management fee or whatever? So that's one thing that's very important. Kind of on the other end of the spectrum, I'll throw out one other thing, and that is what happens if it doesn't work? What happens if there is an unwind? Now, there's a fair amount of economic ramifications there, which, again, we'll talk about on the next podcast. But strictly focusing on the non-economics, exactly what is availed to the practice to recreate itself? Will there be strong non-competes and restrictions? Will there be non-solicitation requirement? Typically, there would be. If, in fact, the group is spending, a PE firm is spending a fair amount of money, which typically is the case with upfront, then does that have to be repaid? Are you buying your practice back, or at least the portion of it that you sold as such? So whether it's the post-transaction operations or hopefully not, but you still have to be realistic and take a look at the post-affiliation structure, restructuring of the practice. These are two very, very important areas that we have to look at and conceptualize in terms of really what to do and what would happen. Beyond that, it's really kind of business as usual. But again, how do you define business as usual within the clinical setting, the governance, and so forth? If you're becoming a part of a much, much larger entity, even if you're the platform practice, your life's going to change quite a bit because it's truly a new co, as we
Yeah.
call it, a new company. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that tees up some further discussion.
Yeah, you mentioned a number of things that I want to circle back on. One of them, though, is the comment you made about kind of the deals done on a Friday and Monday we're all kind of working together. What do you typically see when, as far as change goes? Basically, you asked, let's start at what changes. What about that next week working together? I mean, is that something that more often than not is considered after the ink is dry, or is that something that, again, kind of looking at the seller's perspective, the group, are those conversations they're having long before that paper is ever signed? Is that something that's on the radar, or is it kind of like a new normal when they come back post signing, if you will?
Well, yeah, it should be. It should be that there's a fair amount of discussion that's going to be taking place pre-deal, so there are no surprises. The worst thing in the world you could give the impression of if you're a private equity firm is some sort of bait and switch. Not that that's intentional or would be the actual situation, but it could be the perception if there's not a fair amount of pre-discussion and understanding. And the thing that I found too, and it depends on the size of the group, number of partners, but often these deals are done not without the full partnership's approval, but without the full partnership's knowledge and understanding of what's happening. So typically there might be the lead administrative folks naturally involved in the deal, the due diligence, and then an executive committee, which is, needless to say, very much a subset, maybe even a subset of the board, much less the whole group. And so what happens is there's a lot of, let's just say, lack of knowledge and understanding. Again, it's not intentional. It's not even necessarily by design. It just happens. And so many times after these deals are done, the rank and file, if you will, positions will say, well, wait a minute, I didn't know this was going to happen or that was going to happen. And yet it was part of the deal all along.
Yeah.
Just the mere fact of how they're going to structure their clinic, if in fact that changes. Private equity is not any different than anyone else that's purchasing a part of a medical practice or provider entity. They're going to want to utilize the same level of efficiencies and improvements, changes that may or may not be agreed upon as hospitals or anybody else that would acquire the entity. So I think it's very important that that word matriculate throughout the organization as best it can. And even then, you're still going to have some physicians that, for whatever reason, just weren't paying attention, I suppose, about how this was going to look.
Yeah, I know we've seen instances where some of those surprises came in after the fact,
Yeah.
and they said, "Hey, you didn't tell me this was going to change, or that we were going to have to, do something different here, whatever it may be." And to which the executive committee or the board or whomever it is may respond, "Well, listen, we told you were going to make X dollars off the deal and get these, basically the economics. So, hey, this is what you're gonna make off the deal." And that's where they stop. So I think that's a really good point to say that not only does there need to be discussion about non-economic consideration with the potential buyer, but just within your group, those discussions need to be had. What are going to come in and change and expect differently of us? The other point you made, I thought was really, I want to hone in on it because it's a really good distinction in that doing a deal with hospitals, I mean, if you do a deal with a hospital, yes, they are going to have certain expectations as well. They may come in and change things. I think the ROI, quote unquote, calculation for them, it's not a single calculation, but the mindset, the theory around ROI for a hospital very often is going to be pretty different. Meaning a private equity or a for-profit is just that. They're for-profit. They have returns that they have to generate for their owners or investors or whatever it may be. And so for them, it does boil down. I don't want to minimize this or make it sound negative, but it does boil down to more of an economic target, whereas a not-for-profit hospital may have much broader community-oriented targets that they have to meet.
Yeah, those are great points, and there's no real right or wrong to what we're saying, and a lot of times the efforts are made to explain all this, and then once again, either the focus isn't there, or for whatever reason, it just doesn't sink in until the reality comes to play here. We try to avert that at all costs and try to make everyone aware of what they're getting into. And uh, yet at the same time, that's always a challenge. So I think the way to do this is to have a good system of information dissemination among every group. Every group kind of has their own culture and the way they explain things or don't. And I think in this case, it could be by, if it's a multi-specialty group, it could be by specialty to some extent. It could be, if it's single specialty, by various locations, or some way to break down the information and make sure everyone's aware of what this is involving, and how it might change their lives as such in practice. I think most private equity firms really genuinely do not try to meddle in a practice that's working well, or even semi working well, if you want to call it that. They tend to look at this as a business transaction that they don't necessarily pretend to know how to best run and operate. Again, let's say it's a medical practice or some ancillary service that the practice is managing or overseeing. Some are more involved than others, obviously. But I think for the most part, they leave physicians alone, which is a good thing. But it still is a very, very different way of really living, if you will, in the business setting post transaction. So it requires a fair amount of upfront understanding of, this is what it's going to be like, and this is how it's going to change, and this is how it isn't going to change as such. Uh, certain doctors who've gotten used to certain staffing within their own clinic, that may change, and it may be something that should have been changed years ago but wasn't for whatever reason. A private group can obviously do pretty much what they want to within obvious compliance boundaries. And yet a private equity firm really should be focused on trying to create more efficiency, better throughput, and a better return on investment. Everybody benefits from that, including the doctors.
Yeah.
But it's hard to sell at times, and even harder to explain.
Yeah, it's a good point, because there may be some things that a group just knows, what for whatever reason, that they haven't done it as well. But this could be partnering with a new owner or on a joint venture, whatever it may be. Private equity could be a good opportunity to take that leap and make those improvements, and let them make those improvements. And maybe that's in optimizing revenue cycle, or redoing or getting that new EHR system that you've been putting off for years and years, and improving on other operational management, personnel related matters, things like that. I think there's a lot of, and frankly, those should be conversations that are had beforehand too. I mean, look at what that potential buyer could do to improve, because you're going to probably still retain some ownership or some upside in performance improvement. So that only benefits you.
Yeah, and I think what everyone needs to understand, and I'm not saying they don't understand it, but understanding and putting it into action be two different things. That is, private equity again, it's looking for improved efficiencies and a better bottom line. But they're also, generally speaking, pretty open to and somewhat innovative to expand on technology. So that could entail new technology across a large platform of practices that the practice we're talking about, the new practice being acquired, may not be used to. And so there'd be resistance on the part of the doctors to switch and lower productivity and all the things that typically go with that. We usually mitigate that with hospitals by either guaranteeing the physicians a certain amount of income for a period of time or some other form of satisfaction that the doctors would get from knowing that they'll have a little bit of time to adjust. Private equity is not going to typically do as much of that for the very reasons they exist, which is greater profits. But that's an area that's important. The other thing that I think certain private equity firms would be a little more proactive with developing is value-based, risk-based reimbursement. That is not to say they have the expertise to do that. They may bring in a partner or a consultant or maybe the administrative staff of the practice and the overall entity that's formed from several practices has that expertise. But more and more, there are signs that risk-based contracting in certain components of the practice are very much viable. And see, the other thing that you typically might have is the critical mass of providers to do that. So it used to be before the deal, let's just say you had your 10 physician practice, and now the 10 physician group that's been acquired by private equity is 100 providers. Well, that gives you tremendously more single signature contractual reimbursement negotiation power. And that can eventually evolve into more risk-based contracting. Again, a major change that the doctors could say, well, this was all caused by this private equity deal, and I'm not sure I like it until they cash their paychecks, which might be a lot more, quite frankly, it's done right. So again, I think, Mark, these are some things that our job as we work with private equity or as we work with groups being acquired is to really help pinpoint these opportunities and then explain the pluses and the minuses, I suppose, that come from them.
I agree. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And the last thing I wanted to do before we kind of round out this portion of the discussion on the non-economics is maybe some tips, some practical tips for anyone listening that maybe going through a potential sale or maybe considering it as an option in the future. But for instance, one of the things that I know I've observed one of our clients as they were going through this process was, or they were considering this transaction, and they genuinely wanted to capture the feedback or make sure they were looking at everything in terms of the non-economics. What they did was they kind of essentially took a survey. They had a little bit of I think a town hall kind of, hey, here's what we're looking at. Here's everything we know and Coker has looked at for us from a valuation perspective, from a post-transaction change perspective, all these things. What questions do you have or what feedback do you have? Basically speak now, this is your chance. And give us everything. But specifically, I think they said, what are the questions that you want this buyer or this party that's interested in buying us to answer? Specific as, are you going to make me use a different EHR system? Or are you going to fire my 2 medical assistants? Real kind of in the weeds. Have you seen things like that or any other type things that you've observed?
Yeah, I think the basic questions are all going to be asked and should be answered. Really, these are not earth-shattering. Like I said earlier, many private equity firms, unless they've already built foundation of other practices, then they just fold a particular one into it already in place, you might say, will allow the group to do quite a bit of what they're doing on their own, assuming it's not too inefficient as such. But I think just to kind of take a step back and isolate the first major thing on that list is that when you get into private equity discussion, you have to understand that you're playing hardball in the sense that it's serious stuff. Not to say the other deals aren't serious, and it's very much. I want to be careful how I say this. It's very much an economic play. Now, I didn't say it's out of compliance, it's unethical, or lack of caring for the patient. None of those things did I say or me. But it is a for profit motivation, which there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, again, as long as it is legal and ethical. And so at the same time, you've got to understand that that's what's in play here. And it really works both ways. There's tremendous opportunity for the seller if that's the way you choose to go in terms of your practice and service overall. And of course, for the private equity firm, they make no bones about it that they are in this business to realize a return, just like they are from any other private equity or other industry private equity deal. As a matter of fact, many private equity firms we work with are not just delegated to healthcare. They do other industries. And so they're no less motivated in healthcare as they are, manufacturing or whatever. So I think that's fundamentally in play, and we just got to, change our mindset if that's needed. I think another thing that we have to understand, kind of the checklist, is that there's going to be expectations post-transaction. Now, are there expectations for hospitals? Well, sure. We use the term downstream revenue and things like that when we talk about hospital deals. And a lot of times the inference there is that the post-transaction return doesn't have to be as direct. It's more of a bigger system-oriented downstream revenue and whatnot considered. Whereas a private equity deal, they're looking at each deal and each transaction to provide a return. Now, they may be a part of a larger entity as such that's getting that return, an aggregation of practices, but it still comes down to each practice and each acquisition has to be able to provide a return. And you have to understand and appreciate that that's the way this works. And that's kind of what you've chosen to get into when you do it. And, you kind of have to live with the requirements of that. And so really beyond that, it's just the normal things that you would always look at whenever you're doing your due diligence to decide whether or not it's a viable transaction. The upfront money is helpful. And I was going to mention this earlier real quickly. Just go ahead and say it. As we all know, one of the biggest challenges in private equity is the upfront money. And if you say, well, what's one of the biggest pluses? It's the upfront money. What's one of the biggest minuses? It's the upfront money. It depends on who you're talking to, because older physicians are attracted to that, understandably. Younger physicians are not. And so some level of flexibility within that and education and balance is going to have to happen. And so these are all the things that, again, somewhat economic, but more so non-economic in the sense of what we're talking about today, that really have to be thoroughly explained. And a lot of times you can't get the group to agree to move forward with a private equity deal because you can't build that majority or super majority vote that's needed to do it.
Yeah, it sounds like the other thing, and you kind of alluded to this, and I wanted to mention it, but as you're going through evaluating really any transaction, any business venture, frankly, but and this may sound a little oversimplified, but I think it's a healthy exercise, and you probably are going to do it a few times throughout the process. But to sit down and ideally on the front end, say, here are the things that we would like to get out of this. Here are the must haves. Here are the things that if we can't agree on these things, these are essentials. If we can't get them, then we need to move on or go a different path.
Right.
And then here are the things that we would like to have, but we can compromise a little bit. And again, that's a little oversimplified, but I think what it tells me though is it gives you a little bit of a barometer as you are going through discussions, particularly if you're talking to a potential multiple buyers, if you're going through a kind of a sale where there's multiple parties interested, to evaluate them. And then to be realistic or to be flexible and dynamic, if you will, on those things that you can be flexible on. To basically know no transaction, no venture is going to be, well, I shouldn't say none are like this, but it's likely that you're not going to get everything just perfect.
Right.
And there are going to be some things that you say, all right, yeah, that's not ideal, but hey, we can manage that. Or this over here, if we can't get that, then we know this will not work, and we need to be smart, and we don't need to be sidetracked by dollar signs or this faction of the group wants to do certain things. And we have to be flexible and realistic about the things that we can be flexible on, and almost dogmatic about the things that aren't. Because if you try to force a deal and you break the commitment on some of those essential items, then let's face it, you probably are setting yourself up for some challenges ahead. Would you agree?
Yeah, there's no question that that's really in play. It's really applicable to anybody you're partnering with, but there's probably more typically, and though obviously they've been around longer, understanding of the way hospitals will create a post-transaction atmosphere than private equity. Private equity is still a relatively new dynamic in healthcare, particularly for medical practices. So there definitely requires a higher level of understanding. Just the mere fact that you create earnings that are really not there, they're always distributed to the partners via compensation bonuses to net out any earnings. And all of a sudden, you've gone back in and created this upfront value is it's easy to understand once you explain it, but it's not readily explained or fully understood until you go to the trouble. And then, as I said a moment ago, there are older physicians that say, yeah, that's great. I don't need the income. I'd rather have the money and potentially have it at capital gains rates or part of it at least. And then there's the younger physician who has, 3 kids to put through school and college and all all that, and is more concerned about their current income than something down the road. So very, very challenging situations, but certainly doable. I will say that private equity is very, very much on the forefront. We're seeing, as we hopefully continue to go through a post-COVID era and atmosphere, and I truly believe we're in the post-COVID range, even though I don't want to minimize its importance to everyone still as we record this. But clearly, we're seeing more and more private equity deals, more interest, a lot of capital that's out there for practices. They're not going to throw it away, and give it away. But under shrewd deals, there's a fair amount out there. So I personally think private equity is here to stay for the foreseeable future in healthcare, and perhaps even to a much larger degree.
Yeah. Well, I think that sums it up well. And I think it's a good segue that we'll get back to for the second part of this series, as you were starting to talk about some of those economic considerations and valuation things that we absolutely want to talk about, because you really can't have one. Obviously, you can't have one without the other, meaning the economic and the non-economic. They go hand in hand. They are not mutually exclusive, but they do have their own elements. And I think, again, the reason why we wanted to start with the non-economic piece is because this tends to be the thing that, is either completely missed, or if it's addressed perhaps a little too late and becomes a surprise. And it can be the thing that really makes or breaks transactions, which is important for both the seller but also the buyer. They don't want failed deals. Obviously, that doesn't benefit anyone. And so, this is something that should be on front or top of the list, as opposed to kind of an after the fact thing. So I appreciate you coming on to have this discussion. Yeah. Again, we're going to be continuing in the second part of this, talking about the economic consideration of private equity healthcare deals. And we'll welcome any questions that people have or further discussion on the matter. But until then, we'll look forward to continuing this discussion very soon.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed that episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you for listening. We want to encourage all of our listeners to participate and contribute in the podcast. So if you have any questions on any of the things we discussed in this episode, any of the topics that were presented, please feel free to ask us. Also, we welcome your feedback and suggestions. If you have any ideas related to the material we discussed in this episode, or in any episode, please let us know and we'll make sure to incorporate it. And if you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear more information about in future episodes, please send those suggestions to us. We would love to hear them, and we'd love to incorporate them into our future episodes. You can find us online and on social media. Start with our website, and specifically the podcast is coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find that through the main Coker website at cokergroup.com. You can also find us on social media, Twitter at Coker Group, and then on LinkedIn, you can search for Coker Group and find our page and the page for some of our team members as well there. So you can find us and reach out to us in a number of places. And then if you want to contact us directly, one of the best ways to do that, email feedback@cokergroup.com. That's feedback@cokergroup.com. And again, we'd love to get your feedback. And we'd love to encourage everyone to subscribe to the podcast so that you can be notified when future episodes are released. We look forward to the next episode, and we look forward to getting your suggestions and feedback on this episode. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you again on future episodes.